Hello, and welcome to Burns Banter, the podcast that takes a fresh look at the life and works of Robert Burns, hosted by myself, Alistair Turnbull. Now, in last week's episode, we left Robert in a bit of trouble. He needs to leave Scotland. He's planning to go to Jamaica to emigrate over there. But he has a problem. He doesn't have the money for the passage. So his friend Gavin Hamilton suggests he puts all his poems into a book and he sells the book and raises the money for his passage. Has he done that? Well, in this week's episode, I'm going to talk about how he did manage to publish a book and how that came about. And then I'm going to say what's in the book, which poems are there. And then I'm going to recite a poem from the book. And then I'll tell you a little bit about what happened after the book was released. So let's dive straight in and see how he published the book. Okay, so Robert has a lot of poems. He puts them into a book and he goes to a local publisher in Kilmarnock called John Wilson. And he says to Mr. Wilson, I have this book of poems. I would love for you to publish them so I can sell them, make a bit of money, earn my passage to Jamaica. And if Robert Burns came to your print shop and said, I would love to publish a book, you would go, yeah, I would love you to publish a book, Robert. Come on in. Publish 2 books. But that's because we know him as a world-famous poet. Back then, Robert Burns was a down-to-earth, skint farmer that had no track record in publishing whatsoever. He just sent some poems to his friends and his friends liked it. So not surprisingly, John Wilson said, I'm not going to publish your book. I can't do that. It's too much of a risk. If I put a lot of time and effort into supplying paper, doing the printing, putting the man hours in, getting other people to help me, and the book doesn't sell, then I'll be ruined. It's too much of a risk. And he just told me go away. So Robert's wondering what he's going to do now. He's got all these poems and he can't get them published. So he speaks to his friend Gavin Hamilton again. And he takes Gavin Hamilton along to the printers to speak to John Wilson. And Gavin says, look, these poems are good. They're going to sell. They're going to be great. Gavin Hamilton's a better businessman than Robert and he has more clout. So John Wilson says, well, okay, this is what I'll do for you. If you raise X amount of subscribers, people who say that they're going to buy the book, then I will print it for you. So basically Robert and Gavin and a lot of his friends had to go away and get people to say they're going to buy the book. They had to raise subscribers. They basically crowdfunded it. I mean, we think crowdfunding is a very modern thing. It's not. It's been going on for years. So they got a lot of their friends to go out and say to other pals, please buy this book. They gave him a letter of subscription. Now, Robert Aitken, who's Orator Bob, a very good friend of Robert's, he managed to get 145 subscriptions. Robert Muir from Kilmarnock, he got 70. Gilbert, Robert's brother, got 70 subscriptions. A guy called James Smith got 41. And Gavin Hamilton himself got 40. So it got to a point where the printer, John Wilson, eventually said, okay, that's it. We have enough subscriptions now. I will print the book. So Robert sent his poems in to John. He arranged them, and the book was ready on the 31st of July 1786. The first copies were ready then. Now, to give you a few more facts about it, John Wilson printed 612 copies of that book, and more than half of them were being sold to subscribers, so he was quite happy. As I say, the book came out on the 31st of July. Half them went to subscribers. By the 28th of August, there was only 13 copies left. Just 13. It was really, really popular. And I'll tell you more about that in a minute, but I'm going to dive in and see what's actually in the book now. So let's look at the book itself. Poems chiefly in the Scottish dialect. Right, let's look at the book itself. Now, the first thing I want to tell you is it wasn't originally going to be called Poems Chiefly in the Scottish Dialect. It was just going to be called Scottish Poems. Because in the letters of subscription that Robert and all his friends gave out to the people who they hoped would buy the book, it was just called Scottish Poems. Around about sort of April, May time, Robert added in some more modern English versions of poems and more modern English prose, so he changed the name of the book to Poems Chiefly in the Scottish Dialect. The book itself is 235 pages of prose, of verse, whether they're poems, songs or whatever. There's 235 pages of it and 5 pages of a glossary. The original printing is called the Kilmarnock edition because it was printed in Kilmarnock by John Wilson. And it was originally printed with a blue paper cover, which was meant to be taken off, and then people would put their own leather binding on it to make it look even better. The book itself cost 3 shillings, which is quite a lot. I mean, that's a fair whack of a month's salary for a farm worker. You know, it may be all of a month's salary for a farm worker. I'm not quite sure. But it sold very well. Now, Robert had a lot of his poems in there, but not all of them. He knew that he wrote some poems for his friends that were a bit risky and maybe a bit too politically incorrect or against the church. So he left a few out. He didn't put in Holy Willie's Prayer into the book because that's too radical. It's too much against the church. People wouldn't have liked it in there. There was also one called The Jolly Beggars, which is a cantata, which is all about the people that went to a pub called Pussy Nancy's. That was a bit too much, he thought, for the readership of the book as well, and he left that out. And he also left out a poem called The Court of Equity, The Twa Herds, and The Ordination, because he thought they weren't right for the audience. So what did he put in? He put in, let me just tell you, 36 pieces of work, whether they were poems, songs, epistles, whatever. There was 36 pieces that went in. The very first piece in the book was a story, a poem story called The Twa Dogs. And he's actually called it The Twa Dogs, A Tale, which I think is quite funny. You might not, but I think it's quite good. And The Twa Dogs is about a rich dog and a poor dog. The rich dog's called Caesar, the poor dog's called Luath. Luath is actually the name of Robert's own dog, and he says in this poem it's the dog of a ploughman farmer. So he's basically saying it's his dog. And they were talking about whether it's good to be rich or good to be poor and who's best off. Read the poem, it's very, very good. The middle of the book was really meant to be the star of the show, and that was the Cotters Saturday Night, a really long poem about a cotter on a Saturday night. Well, what is that? A cotter is a sort of peasant farmer, someone who works in the fields all day, and he comes back on a Saturday to his family in his small cottage. And basically it describes their evening. It describes them eating together, talking together, sharing what happened during the day. His father, the father figure, the cotter, handing out advice on what they should do and admonishing a few people from his Christian values. And it really is a snapshot of life back then on a farm. It's excellent. And the very last piece in the book was actually called A Bard's Epitaph, which is fairly depressing, but worth a read anyway. Now, the star of the show out of all these poems, and some of the other poems, you'll recognise the names. I mean, the second poem in the book is Scotch Drink, which is a great poem, and I encourage you to read it. The fourth one is The Holy Fair. That is a great poem. That's Burns at his best. You should really read The Holy Fair. There's Address to the Deal and all the rest of it. A Dream, The Vision, Halloween, To a Moose. To a Moose was just an incidental poem that he wrote one day, and it seems to be one of his best works and one of his best known. That is in there as well. Lots more. Winter, A Dirge, To Ruin, Epistle to a Young Friend. It keeps on going on and on. The Dying Words of Poor Mailey. There's lots in there, lots of poems. It is a great book. The breadth and depth of his knowledge on different subjects, and especially the countryside, is exceptional. And the amount of emotion he gets into some of these poems is exceptional as well. And his insight into the human condition is unparalleled in some of these things as well. So when the book came out, as I said, it sold instantaneously. People from the area just wanted a copy, whether they could afford it or not. They were groups of people were getting together, putting money in and trying to get a book if there was one available, It really was very, very well received. So that's the book itself. Let's move on to what happened to Robert after the book came out. Right, so just let's recap slightly on what Robert's doing at the time when this book is just coming out. He has a child with Elizabeth Patten. Jean Armour is pregnant with his child or children. Jean Armour's father is after him. He's got a writ out. He wants basically to arrest Robert, put him in debtor's prison to give money towards Jean's children. He feels he's been abandoned by Jean. He was with a girl called Highland Mary, or Mary Campbell. She unfortunately died. So Robert at the moment is sofa surfing around his friends to avoid being arrested, basically. And this continues after the book is released. Even though it's received very well and the copies are flying off the shelves, he's still sofa surfing to avoid arrest. He's still planning on going to Jamaica. He's still planning to use the money to buy his fare. What I didn't expect was the amount of praise that he got for these poems and where it came from. I mean, the first thing he got after it from a guy of high social standing was a guy called John Ballantyne, who was a merchant and a banker in Ayr, and he really encouraged Robert to produce a second edition. A woman called Mrs. Dunlop, she's a widow. She was actually a widow of a guy called John Dunlop of Dunlop, believe it or not. And John Dunlop of Dunlop was 23 years older than she was, and she'd given him 6 daughters and 7 sons, and then the guy died. And not surprisingly, she was quite depressed about this. But when she received a copy of Robert's book, it really kind of brought her back to life again. And she wrote to Robert saying, and she's quite high up social standing as well, She wrote to Robert saying, "This is a great book. These poems have really revived me. I'm really encouraged by them. You should write more poems." So Robert's starting to think, do I have more of a choice to stay in Scotland now? Can I stay in Scotland a bit longer? I don't know. Let's find out. So he's encouraged by all these people. Unfortunately, he gets a bit big-headed, and one day he was, just after the book came out and he got all these letters of recommendation and encouragement, he was walking on the grounds of the Ballochmyle estate, and he came across Wilhelmina Alexander, who was an unmarried sister of the guy that lived on the estate. She had 2 brothers that lived on the estate with her. And he wrote a letter to her with a song called The Bonnie Lass of Ballochmyle, and he really praised her beauty and all the rest of it. And probably a bit too much. He was probably a bit kind of over-egging it a bit because of all the praise he'd been getting. She didn't know how to take it, didn't reply to him. He asked if he could put it in a second edition of his book if he brought one out. She never replied, and he didn't like the snub, which is quite unfortunate because years later, when Wilhelmina realised that he was actually being sincere, and she never married, and she became a sort of spinster, and she carried that poem with her everywhere. She kept the original. Wherever she went, she kept the original poem that Burns had sent her. She eventually died at 88 years of age. I think it was 1823 she died in Glasgow. Anyway, Robert took that as a snub, and he kind of came down a peg a bit because he knew everybody wasn't liking his poems. But he was very, very lucky that one of his books went to a guy called the Reverend George Laurie from the Loudon parish, which is just outside of Kilmarnock. And the Reverend Laurie was also he was a minister, he was a musician, he was an artist, and he knew some very influential people in Edinburgh, very influential. And one of the guys that he knew in Edinburgh was a guy called Dr. Thomas Blacklock, also a minister. Now, Thomas Blacklock was he's blind. He lost his sight when he was 6 years old due to smallpox. But he now lives in Edinburgh, he's married, and he's in a social circle hugely above Burns, in the stratosphere. I mean, Thomas Blacklock is entertaining people such as Benjamin Franklin came to his house one time, Sir Walter Scott was there, Samuel Johnston had been to see him. That's the kind of calibre of person that Thomas Blacklock was meeting. And Thomas Blacklock, being a critic as well as a poet, read Burns's work and said, "This is excellent. This is brilliant stuff. I can't believe the insight you've got here. I can't believe the emotion I'm seeing." And he wrote a letter to Burns saying, "You should not go to Jamaica. You should come to Edinburgh immediately, and you should produce a bigger and better second edition of your works." Now, when Robert got that one from Thomas Blacklock, he said to his friends he never expected in his wildest dreams to receive praise from such lofty places. That, I think, is when he decided not to go to Jamaica. That was it. "I'm not going to go to Jamaica," he said. And he decided he was going to go to Edinburgh and produce a second volume of poems. Now, that's a story in itself, and I'm going to leave that till next week. So, at the moment, Robert's decided not to go to Jamaica. He's got a little bit of money in his pocket. He's going to head to Edinburgh to produce a second volume of his work. I'll leave that there till next week, and I'll tell you all about that. Now, let's look at one of the poems in the book. Poems chiefly in the Scottish dialect. The poem I've chosen to read from Poems chiefly in the Scottish dialect is a poem called Composed in August, also known as Now Westlin Winds and Slaughtering Guns. And it mentions a lot of nature. It mentions things like a patrick, a plover, a woodcock, a heron, a cushat. Now, they're all just birds. They're all Scottish names for birds. But he talks about his charmer in here and Peggy and all the rest of it. Now, that relates back to a girl he knew in 1775. But his sister, who later in life was called Mrs. Begg, said he made a copy of this song when he was dating Jean Armour. And originally he had Jean Armour's name in there instead of Peggy. And he took out the name Jean and Armour and put in the word charmer, just to try and hide who he was having a relationship with. So this kind of fits in with the sort of time that he's at the moment when he's writing the book and releasing the book and being with Jean. Anyway, here we go. Composed in August. Now Westlin winds and slaughtering guns bring autumn's pleasant weather. The moorcock springs on whirring wings among the blooming heather. Now waving grain wide over the plain delights the weary farmer, and the moon shines bright as I rove by night to muse upon my charmer. The patrick loves the fruitful fells, the plover loves the mountains, the woodcock haunts the lonely dells, the soaring hern the fountains. Through lofty groves the cushat roves, the path of man to shun it. The hazel bush o'erhangs the thrush, the spreading thorn the linnet. Thus every kind their pleasure find, the savage and the tender. Some social join, and leagues combine, some solitary wander. Avaunt, away, the cruel sway, tyrannic man's dominion, the sportsman's joy, the murdering cry, the fluttering gory pinion. But Peggy dear, the evening's clear, thick flies the skimming swallow, the sky is blue, the fields in view, all fading green and yellow. Come let us stray our gladsome way, and view the charms of nature, the rustling corn, the fruited thorn, and every happy creature. We'll gently walk, and sweetly talk, while the silent moon shines clearly. I'll grasp thy waist, and fondly pressed, swear how I love thee dearly. Not vernal showers or budding flowers, not autumn to the farmer, so dear can be as you to me, my fair and lovely charmer. Yes, he definitely hasn't got Jean Armour out of his head yet. So, his book is published. His fame is now spread much wider than his native Ayrshire. He's decided to stay in Scotland, not go to Jamaica, even though there's an arrest warrant out for him. He's decided to head to Edinburgh and produce a second edition of poems. Will he get there? How does he get there? What sort of reception is he met when he gets there? Find out in next week's episode. But until then, Slán Java.